Have you ever wondered why the Creator chooses the broken, the deceivers? The men racked with fear. My name is Jacob, and my story is an uncomfortable truth about human nature and divine plans. I look back on my origins in the 25th chapter of Genesis, the dawn of a chosen nation, and I see a world where cunning fought integrity. It started before I even drew breath. My father, Isaac, watched my mother, Rebekah, carry the agonizing curse of a barren womb for 20 long years. He cried out to the Lord in pure desperation for an heir to Abraham's great promise, and finally, God answered him. But that divine intervention did not come peacefully. And the answer to my father's desperate plea was far from a simple, uncomplicated blessing. The complications began deep in the dark isolation of my mother's womb. My brother and I fought violently before we even saw the sun. Terrified by the war inside her body, my mother cried out to God. The Lord revealed a frightening destiny. 2 nations were warring within her. One would be stronger, and shockingly, the older would serve the younger. That prophecy overturned the entire natural order. From the very beginning, I felt the crushing pressure of a destiny I did not ask for. When the day of our birth arrived, my brother Esau pushed his way out first. He was red, covered in thick hair like a rough garment, a wild creature from his first breath. And then there was me, following right behind him, my tiny hand clinging desperately to his heel. Because I held his heel, they named me Jacob the Deceiver. My father was 60 when we were born, but his joy was shadowed by the divide between us. Esau was rugged, wild, and dangerously impulsive. I was the quiet one, burdened by a desperate need to survive my brother's overwhelming presence. As we grew, the isolation set in. Esau became a master hunter, roaming the open country, the absolute masculine ideal of our ancient world. I stayed behind, lonely among the quiet tents, feeling the constant sting of inadequacy. My father craved the wild game Esau brought home, and he loved Esau deeply. The sheer pain of my father's rejection hollowed me out. My only refuge was my mother. She loved me, but her fierce love came with the heavy, unbearable weight of that dangerous prophecy. That toxic favoritism poisoned our home, sowing a bitter rivalry I could never escape. The turning point happened over a simmering pot of lentil stew. I was alone, stirring the broth, when Esau staggered in from the wild, exhausted and famished. He demanded the food. In that moment, a dark temptation gripped my soul. I saw a dangerous opening to seize the identity I felt I deserved. I told him to sell me his birthright. Esau, driven only by his hunger, scoffed that he was about to die anyway. What good was a birthright to a dead man? My heart pounded as I made him swear a sacred oath. He traded his entire future for a single bowl of food. He ate, drank, and walked away, completely despising the sacred blessing I was so fiercely desperate to possess. Esau was blinded by his cravings. He willingly threw away the greatest honor in our society just to quiet his stomach. His dramatic claim of dying from hunger showed exactly who he was. But what does that day say about me? I was cold and calculated. I manipulated my brother's weakness without a second thought. I felt an overwhelming pressure to secure my future, to become the man my father refused to see. I knew the immense value of that birthright, and I sacrificed my own integrity to steal it. That exchange of stew for a sacred promise became the defining shadow of my youth. I did not realize it then, staring at his empty bowl. But that ruthless choice would soon haunt my every waking moment, setting a dangerous trap that would alter our bloodline forever. The weight of what I had done terrified me. The birthright was never just about wealth. It carried the ancient spiritual blessing of Abraham and the heavy responsibility of leading our people. By tossing it aside, Esau mocked the God of our ancestors. but my soul felt no cleaner. Buying that birthright was the first step in a lonely, dangerous descent into deceit. I was starving to be the chosen heir, and that hunger drove me to compromise my integrity repeatedly. My cunning was a poison that kept dragging me into unimaginable danger. Even now, I tremble at how the Creator used my flawed, treacherous nature to build His kingdom. The ultimate test of my fragile identity arrived. Years later, bringing a terrifying moment that would shatter my family forever. I will never forget the creeping dread when my father, old and blind, summoned my brother. His pale, sightless eyes made the tent feel thick with a morbid urgency. I hid in the shadows, listening as Isaac told Esau to hunt wild game and prepare a final meal, so that his soul might bestow the final blessing before he died. That sentence struck my heart like a dagger. The blessing was a powerful, prophetic seal, dictating a man's entire lineage. Despite the sacred oath Esau had sworn, my father still blindly favored his wild son. He was about to hand over the ultimate inheritance, completely erasing my existence. The agonizing sting of being the unloved son flared in my chest, stoking a deep, terrifying fear that I was about to lose my true identity forever. My father's stubborn intention to bless Esau lit the fuse of our family's destruction, but I wasn't the only one in the shadows. My mother had been listening. As soon as Esau left for the fields, she pulled me aside, her eyes filled with a frantic intensity. She warned me the blessing was about to slip away forever. Then she gave an unthinkable command. I was to fetch 2 young goats so she could forge my father's favorite meal. The sheer audacity of her scheme made my blood run cold. She was actively plotting to deceive her own blind husband. It was an incredibly reckless gamble, and as she laid out the twisted steps, I felt a suffocating panic. The crushing burden of this deceit was falling entirely on my shoulders. If I was caught, I would be utterly destroyed. She pushed me into a terrifying danger. I know now she was trying to force God's prophecy, but I only felt absolute panic. I stammered out my frantic objections. Esau is a hairy man and my skin is smooth, I pleaded with her. What if he reaches out and touches me? I will bring a deadly curse upon my own head. But my mother didn't flinch. She coldly commanded me to let the curse fall on her. Numb with dread, I obeyed. I brought the animals. I watched her cook the meat. Then she brought out Esau's finest garments, heavy with the stench of the wild, and draped them over my trembling frame. To hide my smooth skin, she bound pieces of coarse, dead goat skin to my hands and my neck. I felt violently sick, suffocating inside my brother's stolen identity. Wrapped in dead animal skins, trembling under the weight of the food, my resolve nearly shattered. Looking back, I feel deep shame. My hesitation wasn't born of righteousness, but sheer, cowardly fear of getting caught. My mother's iron will forced me into the dark tent. The air inside was suffocating. My father, I whispered. The blind old man shifted. Who are you, my son? The dreadful lie tore out of my mouth before I could stop it. I am Esau, your firstborn. I begged him to sit and eat, but his ear was sharp. He asked how I had found the game so fast. Paralyzed by panic, I committed the ultimate blasphemy, claiming the Lord his God had granted me success. The silence that followed was sheer agony. Highly suspicious, my father ordered me to step closer into the darkness. Come near, he croaked, his eyes searching the shadows. Let me touch you to know if you are really my son Esau. My body screamed to run. I had already lied to his face, dragging God's name into my deceit, but this physical test was pure terror. I stepped into his reach, holding my breath as his frail hands felt up my arms, pressing into the rough goat skins. The tension in the dark tent was sheer agony. The voice is Jacob, he murmured with deep suspicion, but the hands are Esau. He was torn, his senses violently warring against each other. But the dead animal skins worked. Trusting his fading touch over his ears, he pulled me against his chest. He buried his face in my stolen clothes, inhaled the deep scent of the wild, and finally surrendered the sacred blessing. I still remember the heavy scent of earth and unwashed wool as my blind father leaned in, breathing the smell of garments that were not mine. He spoke words that sealed my destiny, praying for the dew of heaven to fall on me, for the earth to yield its richest grain and finest new wine. He declared that nations would serve me, that my own brother would bow before me, echoing the ancient whisper God gave my mother before we were born. Whoever cursed me would be cursed. It was a terrifying weight, stealing a spiritual kingdom while wearing another man's skin. I felt the awful thrill of the theft, knowing that at any second, Esau would return from the wild, and the violent unraveling of my desperate deception would finally begin. I had barely slipped out of the tent, the stolen words still ringing in my ears, when Esau's heavy footsteps echoed in the camp. He had proudly prepared his wild game, carrying it to the old man's bed to claim his rightful blessing. Hiding in the shadows, my heart pounded against my ribs as I listened to my father ask who stood before him. When Esau spoke his name, the silence that followed was suffocating. I heard my father begin to shake, a violent, helpless trembling as the horror of my deceit set in. He told Esau he had already poured out the sacred birthright upon me, knowing the ancient promise could never be unsaid. Hearing those words, Esau unleashed a loud, shattered scream that tore through the desert air, begging wildly for a blessing that I had already stolen. The blessing was a prophetic decree burned into reality, impossible to erase. Hiding in the dark, I felt a crushing guilt as Esau wept. He choked on my name, calling me the Deceiver, crying that I had taken his birthright and now his future. He desperately begged our father to find just one blessing left for him. But my father's voice was hollow, explaining he had already made me master over him, giving me the earth's riches. Esau broke down completely, weeping aloud. Only in that devastating moment did my brother truly grasp the weight of the destiny he once threw away so carelessly. It shattered something deep inside me to hear the strongest man I knew weeping like a frightened child, pleading for the fragile scraps of a future I had so ruthlessly stolen. My father finally spoke, but his words held no comfort. He warned Esau he would live far from the earth's richness and the gentle dew of heaven. He was doomed to survive by the sword, forced to serve me until the day he finally shattered my yoke from his neck. It was a bleak, harsh fate. In that bitter darkness, Esau's sorrow hardened into a terrifying, murderous rage. Whispers quickly reached my mother that my brother was counting the days. He swore that once our father passed away and the mourning ended, he would hunt me down and kill me. His hatred felt like a living thing, tightening around my throat. I was suddenly prey in the only home I had ever known. Sensing the absolute, imminent danger closing in around me, my mother knew she had to craft a desperate plan to save my life. My mother pulled me into the shadows, her eyes filled with frantic fear. Esau was plotting my murder, she warned, and I had to run. She ordered me to flee to her brother Laban in Haran, telling me to hide until Esau's fury cooled and he forgot my deep betrayal. Her voice broke as she whispered she could not survive losing both sons in a single day of bloodshed. I felt my identity completely slipping away, stripped of the only life I knew. Before I left, my blind father called for me. To my absolute shock, he did not curse me. Instead, he firmly commanded me never to marry a local Canaanite woman, urging me to find a proper wife among my mother's people in Paddan Aram. With those heavy words, the terrifying isolation of my long exile began. Waiting for his judgment, I heard my father bless me again, this time fully knowing who I was. He prayed God Almighty would make me fruitful, multiplying my line into a great community. He handed down the ancient blessing of Abraham, praying I would possess the land where we lived as foreigners. It felt entirely surreal. Despite my deceit, my father yielded to God's mysterious will. With his heavy words echoing in the air, I turned my back on my childhood home forever. I left behind a deeply fractured family and a brother thirsty for my blood. Walking toward Paddan Aram to find Laban, the terrifying reality of my isolation settled heavily upon my shoulders. I had stolen a vast spiritual kingdom. Yet here I was, walking into the harsh desert with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. Every step from Beersheba felt like walking into a void. I wasn't just escaping Esau's wrath. I was running from the man I used to be. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving a biting, hollow chill. I had always stayed safely by the tents, shielded by my mother. Now, my own deceit had driven me into the desolate wilderness. Exhausted and crushed by the guilt of my broken family, I searched the empty landscape for shelter. I found nothing but cold, unforgiving dirt. Desperate for rest, I picked up a heavy stone, placed it under my head for a pillow, and pulled my cloak tight against the wind. Lying out in the pitch-black open, completely exposed to the wild, it was the most pathetic, lonely moment of my life. I felt entirely abandoned, unaware that heaven was about to break wide open. I closed my eyes, and suddenly the dark desert tore away. In a vision, a glowing stairway materialized, its base planted in the dirt beside me, its peak vanishing into heaven. Paralyzed with awe, I watched radiant angels ascending and descending, bridging my lonely patch of earth to the divine. Above it all stood the Lord himself. His voice shook my very core. He declared he was the God of Abraham and Isaac, promising to give this land to my descendants, spreading us to every corner of the earth. Then came the words that finally broke my fearful heart. He promised to stay by my side, to fiercely protect me wherever I ran, and to bring me safely home. Even though I was a runaway deceiver, he swore he would never abandon me until his glorious promise was fully accomplished. I woke gasping, the cold wind whipping my face, that blinding light still burning in my mind. I trembled, pulling my knees to my chest. "Surely the Lord is in this desolate place," I whispered, and I was completely blind to it. A profound, terrifying reverence washed over me. This wasteland was the very gate of heaven. At sunrise, I took the rough stone that bruised my head and stood it upright in the dirt. I poured my meager flask of oil over the rock, consecrating the ground. I renamed that lonely place Bethel. Right there, shivering and afraid, I made a desperate vow. I swore that if God would truly stay with me, protect my fugitive steps, give me bread and clothes, and somehow bring me back to my father's house in peace, then he would forever be my God. I vowed that of everything he provided, I would return a tenth to him. For the first time, I wasn't leaning on my father's faith. He was becoming my own God. With renewed strength, I walked endless miles until I reached the land of the eastern peoples. My legs felt like lead, my throat burning. Ahead I spotted a well in a wide field, 3 flocks of sheep resting beside it. A massive stone covered the opening, sealing the water until the shepherds gathered to move it together. Desperate for a familiar thread, I approached the dusty men and asked where they were from. When they answered Haran, my pulse raced. Standing there in the sweltering heat, fighting exhaustion, I held my breath and asked the crucial question. Did they know my uncle Laban? "Yes, we know him," they replied, pointing across the field. "Here comes his daughter Rachel." Through the shimmering heat, I saw her approaching with the sheep. A fierce adrenaline flooded my exhausted body. This was my mother's blood. Ignoring the men who refused to open the well, I marched over, grabbed the massive stone, and shoved it away entirely by myself. I frantically watered her flock. When I turned to Rachel, I kissed her cheek and completely broke down. Every ounce of fear, bitter loneliness, and the crushing guilt of my exile poured out in loud, heaving sobs. I choked out the words, telling her I was Rebekah's son. Her eyes widened with shock. Without a word, she turned and sprinted back to the tents to tell her father Laban that I had finally arrived. Have you ever run so far from your own name that you completely forgot who you were? I was an exile, a deceiver running for my life from my brother Esau. When I arrived at the well and saw Rachel, my entire world stopped. I pushed that massive stone away from the well entirely on my own, just to see her smile. When her father Laban heard I had arrived, he ran to embrace me. He kissed my cheeks, calling me his own flesh and blood. I thought I had finally found a safe haven in the wilderness. But his warm hearth rapidly became a cage. He asked what my wages should be for my labor. Laban had 2 daughters. The older Leah had weak, weary eyes, but Rachel was a breathtaking vision in the desert. My choice was already made. My heart was completely consumed by her. I looked my uncle Laban in the eye and offered him my life, 7 agonizing years of backbreaking labor for Rachel's hand in marriage. He smiled a calculating, dangerous smile and agreed to keep me close. I gave him the best years of my youth. I tended his flocks under the scorching sun. Yet those 7 years passed like a handful of days because of my profound love for her. Then came the wedding feast. The wine flowed freely. The desert night was pitch black, and Laban brought his veiled daughter into my dark tent. I embraced her, entirely unaware that the man who had deceitfully stolen his brother's blessing was about to be destroyed by a devastating lie. The harsh morning sun pierced the heavy canvas of my tent, and the truth hit me like a physical blow. It was Leah. The woman lying beside me was not the one I loved. I tore through the camp, my chest tight with suffocating panic and rage, shouting at Laban, "What is this terrible thing you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me?" The heavy silence that followed my outburst was absolutely deafening. In the shadows of my own mind, I heard Esau asking our blind father that exact same agonizing question. I was the master deceiver, suddenly tasting the bitter ash of my own medicine in the cruel daylight. Laban demanded 7 more years for Rachel. Trapped, I surrendered my freedom again. I finally took Rachel as my wife, but a dark, suffocating shadow of rivalry immediately fell over my household. I loved Rachel far more than Leah, blindly repeating the toxic cycle of favoritism that had shattered my own childhood. The silent war between the sisters played out entirely in the birthing tents. Leah bore me Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, desperately hoping each son would finally win my heart. Meanwhile, Rachel remained barren, her empty arms a source of bitter, quiet agony. The tension was a living, breathing thing inside my home. They began throwing their handmaidens at me just to keep score. I was building a massive family, but I was completely losing control of my own life and identity. Every single child felt like a weapon forged in their relentless war for my love. The names they chose echoed their deep sorrows, their bitter jealousies, and their desperate prayers. My years in Haran completely broke me down and rebuilt me. I was no longer the lone fugitive. I was tangled in a web of deceit, grueling labor, and endless family strife. Yet in the crushing weight of it all, God was silently keeping his promise to make me a great nation. When Rachel finally gave birth to Joseph, a sudden, desperate longing for the land of my fathers seized my soul. I begged Laban to let me take my wives and my children and leave. I had paid my debt. But he tightened his grip, terrified of losing the source of his wealth. Laban's eyes gleamed with a dark, greedy knowledge. He confessed that his unholy divination proved his vast wealth came solely from the divine blessing resting on my shoulders. I struck a dangerous bargain, claiming only the spotted and speckled sheep for my wages. I worked the breeding grounds, relentlessly, battling the brutal elements, and against all human logic, my flocks multiplied. But my sudden success bred a deadly poison. I heard the raw venom in the voices of Laban's sons. They falsely accused me of stealing their inheritance. The air in the camp turned hostile, and Laban's face grew cold. I was entirely alone. Then the powerful voice of the Lord shattered my isolation. Return to the land of your ancestors. God's promise to be with me was the only anchor I had left. I gathered Rachel and Leah secretly in the open fields, terrified that Laban's spies were listening, and told them of the holy dream. To my profound relief, they agreed to run, deeply wounded by their father treating them like foreign strangers. We waited anxiously for the heavy season of sheep shearing. When Laban vanished into the distant hills, I frantically packed my entire life onto the backs of camels. We fled, driving our massive flocks toward the hill country of Gilead, crossing the great Euphrates River. I was running again, and I had absolutely no idea that in the chaos, Rachel had secretly stolen the ancient household idols from her father's sacred tent. For 3 agonizing days, the vast desert held our desperate secret. Then the devastating news reached Laban. I can only imagine the cold fury in his eyes as he rallied his armed men, hunting us across the unforgiving wasteland for 7 terrifying days. My heart hammered violently against my ribs when I finally saw the massive dust cloud of his approaching army at Gilead. We were completely cornered. But the unseen God of my fathers had not abandoned me to the slaughter. In the dead of night, God terrified Laban in a dark dream, strictly warning him not to harm me. When his armed camp finally settled aggressively right beside ours, the crushing tension was thick enough to suffocate every single one of us. Laban stormed fiercely into my camp, accusing me of stealing his sacred gods. Entirely unaware of Rachel's terrible secret, I confidently invited him to tear through every single tent. I watched as he searched relentlessly, finally reaching Rachel, who sat calmly on her saddle, claiming the way of women prevented her from rising. She was hiding the idols right beneath her. When he found absolutely nothing, 20 years of suppressed, agonizing rage exploded from my lungs. I screamed at him about the scorching desert days, the freezing, bitter nights, the stolen sleep, and how he had cruelly changed my wages 10 times. I had borne every loss, completely breaking my own body to build his magnificent empire. I stared him down and told him plainly that if the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not shielded me, he would have cast me out into the dirt with nothing. The vicious fight slowly drained out of us both, leaving only the cold, harsh reality of our broken bond. We dragged massive stones together, piling them high to create a silent, permanent witness to our uneasy peace. He named the boundary in his tongue, but I called it Galied. When the pale morning sun finally broke over the horizon, Laban kissed my children one last time and vanished into the dust. I stood there breathing the wild air. I was no longer a frightened exile. I was a patriarch, entirely free of my master, but completely terrified of what lay ahead. As I marched forward, angels of God suddenly materialized in my path, a terrifying, holy host at Mahanaim. It was a stark, jarring reminder of the massive spiritual war surrounding my every step. Desperate to make peace, I sent messengers ahead to Edom, hoping to appease the brother I had betrayed so long ago. They returned with news that completely paralyzed my soul. Esau was coming to meet me, and 400 armed men marched fiercely behind him. Blind, suffocating panic seized my throat. I frantically tore my camp in two, hoping to save at least half of my family from the impending slaughter. I fell to my knees in the absolute dirt, crying out to the God of my fathers to save me from the bloody harvest of my own lies. Have you ever realized you don't deserve the grace you've been given? You and I know that feeling well. I stand in the dust, trembling. I crossed this Jordan River 20 years ago with nothing but a wooden staff. Now I have two sprawling camps, but the fear in my chest is suffocating. Esau is coming. My brother marches toward me with 400 armed men. I am paralyzed by the thought that he will slaughter us all, the mothers, the innocent children, everyone. I cry out into the empty night, begging the Almighty to remember His promise to make my family like the sand of the sea. I frantically send waves of gifts ahead, desperate to buy His mercy. After 20 years of hiding, I am still just a terrified deceiver waiting for the sword to fall. I send my family across the shallow Jabbok River. Watching them vanish into the shadows, a crippling isolation sets in. I am alone in the suffocating dark. Suddenly, a figure is upon me. We violently clash in the dirt. It is a brutal struggle under the cold stars, muscles straining until the first hint of daybreak. He cannot break my desperate grip, so he strikes my hip. The pain is a blinding flash, the joint tearing from the bone. Still, I refuse to let go. I will not release you unless you bless me, I scream, gasping for air. He asks for my name, the name of a lifelong deceiver. Jacob, I confess. His voice shatters the dawn. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. You have wrestled with the Almighty and survived. My old identity dies right there in the dust. I drag myself from the riverbank, entirely transformed. The blessing is mine, but so is this crippling wound. With every agonizing step, my profound limp serves as a harsh reminder that I collided with the divine. Then I lift my eyes. The horizon is choked with dust. Esau is here. 400 men march behind him, an army of vengeance. My heart hammers against my bruised ribs as I shield my family, moving Rachel and Joseph to the very back. My legs shake, my torn hip burning with sharp pain, yet I step forward alone to face my judgment. I drop to my knees. I bow my face into the dirt 7 times, completely surrendering my fragile pride. I am nothing but a broken man, crawling toward the brother I deeply betrayed. Silently praying he will not draw his blade, I brace myself for the strike of his blade, but the blow never comes. Instead, I hear heavy footsteps rushing toward me. Esau is running. He throws his massive arms around my neck, pulling me into a desperate embrace. He is weeping into my shoulder, and suddenly my own tears fall. The paralyzing dread of 20 years dissolves in an instant. Time has washed away his bitter hatred. Overwhelmed with relief, I beg him to take my offerings. Please accept these gifts, I plead, my voice cracking. God has shown me unimaginable grace. In that quiet field, our fractured souls are finally mended. We part in peace. Esau turns his men back toward Seir, while I guide my exhausted family toward Succoth. I build shelters for my livestock and carve out a quiet place to finally rest. After the wilderness, I lead my people to the city of Shechem in Canaan. I buy a plot of land for 100 pieces of silver and pitch my weary tent. I build an altar, convinced my painful wandering days are over, but the illusion of peace shatters in a horrifying way. My precious daughter Dinah wanders into the city, and the ruler's son brutally takes her. The violation rips my family apart. Suffocating darkness swallows my household. Though the young man claims he loves her and begs for marriage, my sons Simeon and Levi are consumed by a terrifying, silent rage. I watch in pure dread as they plot their violent revenge. They weaponize our sacred covenant, demanding the city's men undergo circumcision. The cycle of deceit and blood is starting again. You and I are stepping into the dust of this ancient world, but suddenly, the screen fades. I feel the rough wool of my tunic. I am Reuben, the firstborn, and the copper stench of blood is everywhere. Simeon and Levi have just butchered an entire city. I watch our father, Jacob, his face pale with horror. You have made me a stench to the Canaanites. He screams, his voice cracking with the lonely dread of a man who knows we are vastly outnumbered. We are a single spark away from being wiped out. In the chilling aftermath, a desperate command comes down. We must flee to Bethel. I help gather the terrified household as my father demands. We throw away our foreign idols and scrub the blood from our clothes. We are going back to the altar, searching for a lifeline in the dark. We finally reach Bethel, and for a fleeting moment the crushing pressure lifts. I stand in the shadows as the Almighty speaks over my father, sealing his new identity. He is no longer Jacob the Deceiver, he is Israel. A promise of kings and nations echoes through the valley, an overwhelming destiny meant for our family line. But the comfort does not last. The road to Ephrath is brutal, and the heavy silence is broken by agonizing screams. Rachel, my father's most beloved wife, goes into early labor. I stand helplessly by the tents, listening to the panic. The midwife desperately tries to soothe her, shouting that another son is coming, but the life is already draining from Rachel's eyes. In her final, agonizing breath, drowning in pain and sorrow, she names the boy Benoni, the son of my deepest sorrow. I watch my father's heart shatter all over again. My father stubbornly changes the baby's name to Benjamin, refusing to let him bear the mark of sorrow. We bury Rachel right there on the dusty road to Bethlehem. Her death breaks something profound in my father, leaving him hollowed out. And this is where my own darkness takes over. Feeling the massive weight of my fading identity as the eldest, drowning in the loneliness of our broken camp, I give in to a twisted temptation. I sleep with Bilhah, my father's concubine. It is a reckless grab for authority, but the moment it happens, cold dread sets in. My father finds out. The suffocating silence that follows seals my doom, ripping my birthright away forever. Our spiritual renewal is completely overshadowed by these catastrophic tragedies. We finally drag our fractured family back to Hebron, returning to the ancient house of my grandfather. We arrive in Mamre, just in time to watch the end of an era. My grandfather, Isaac, breathes his last. For one fragile moment, my father and his estranged brother Esau stand shoulder to bury him. But the peace in our family is a temporary illusion. You might be wondering the same thing I did. How could my father repeat the exact mistakes that tore his own childhood apart? Yet he does. He openly favors Joseph, showering him with a sickeningly clear preference. The moment he drapes that ornate, colorful robe over Joseph's shoulders, a dark venom spreads through the rest of us. I watch my brothers clench their fists, their eyes burning with intense, terrifying jealousy. We are entirely pushed to the fringes of our own family, stripped of our worth. Soon, absolutely none of us can even force a single kind word toward the golden boy. That coat becomes a walking monument to our rejection. Joseph makes it worse by sharing his visions, claiming our sheaves of wheat bowed to his, and that the stars themselves worshipped him. We are deep in the lonely wilderness when we see that miserable coat on the horizon. Here comes that dreamer, someone mutters. The plan to murder him becomes terrifyingly real. They want to throw him in a pit and blame a wild beast. The panic in my chest is unbearable. If he dies, his blood is on my hands. Let's not take his life. I plead, convincing them to just drop him into a dry cistern instead. My secret plan is to sneak back and rescue him later, desperate to win back my father's shattered trust. But my authority is already gone. While my back is turned, Judah's cold voice cuts through the harsh desert wind, convincing the rest to sell our own flesh and blood into Egyptian slavery. Have you ever felt the creeping dread that your own flesh and blood might be hiding a monstrous secret? Step into the burning sands of Canaan with me today. I am looking through the eyes of the patriarch Jacob, and the air is thick with an unspoken betrayal. You and I know what really happened out there in the wilderness. How? Judah coldly convinced the others to spare my boy's life, only to sell him into slavery. We can almost hear the clink of those 20 silver shekels exchanging hands with the Midianites. But standing by my tent, scanning the horizon for my favorite son, I know none of this. I am completely unaware that the very sons who eat at my table have just ripped my heart out and sent it away to Egypt. They walked toward me, their faces masked in a terrifying, solemn silence. When they held up that beautiful, ornate robe, the one I had woven with my own hands, it was soaked in thick, dark blood. The floor completely fell out from under me. A ferocious beast has devoured him. I tore my clothes until my hands bled, wrapping my frail body in coarse, agonizing sackcloth. You and I have probably both experienced grief, but this was a total annihilation of my identity. I refused their empty comfort, screaming that I would weep into the darkness of my own grave. For years, I lived in this hollow, crushing loneliness, trapped in a nightmare created by the very children trying to console me. It was a terrifying, suffocating darkness. Then, as if the suffocating grief was not enough, the skies turned to iron and famine ravaged our lands. You can feel that kind of desperation deep in your bones. I looked at my remaining sons, grown men just staring at each other in paralyzed fear while our supplies vanished. I demanded they go to Egypt to buy grain so we would not starve. But the nightmare only tightened its grip on my throat. When they returned without Simeon, demanding to take Benjamin, my final tether to my beloved Rachel, I completely broke. "You have deprived me of my children," I cried out. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now Benjamin. The immense, crushing pressure of losing everything I loved was entirely against me. I was entirely alone. I fought it for as long as I could, holding onto Benjamin like a drowning man clutching his last piece of wreckage. Stick with me here, because this is the moment where faith demands everything you have left. The hunger was relentless, and Judah offered his own life as a guarantee. I had to let him go. I gathered our best remaining products: balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds, and forced them into their bags along with double the silver. "Take your brother," I whispered, my voice trembling. "May God Almighty grant you mercy before this harsh Egyptian ruler." As I watched them walk away, the loneliness closed over me like a heavy tomb. I surrendered my control entirely. If I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. But the story does not end in the dark. We are about to uncover what really went down in the opulent halls of Egypt. While I sat in Canaan, wasting away in sorrow, a miracle was unfolding. Joseph, my lost boy, finally dropped his mask and revealed himself to his brothers. He commanded them to rush back to me with a message that defies all reality. "God has made me Lord of all Egypt," he told them. He wanted me to pack up everything, my children, flocks, and herds, and come down to the lush region of Goshen before the remaining 5 years of famine destroyed us completely. He was preparing a sanctuary for the very family that had broken him. The sheer grace of it is overwhelming, yet sitting in my dusty tent, I knew nothing at all. When my sons stumbled back and blurted out that Joseph was alive and ruling Egypt, my heart almost stopped. I stared at them, completely stunned. I did not believe a single word. My mind had spent decades accepting his violent death. How could I rewire my reality in mere seconds? But then I stepped outside and saw the magnificent Egyptian carts he had sent. My shattered spirit suddenly sparked back to life. "I am convinced," I cried out. "I will go and see him before I die." Yet, the terror of leaving the promised land was immense. That night in Beersheba, God called out, "Jacob, Jacob." I answered, terrified. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I will go down to Egypt with you, make you a great nation, and Joseph will close your eyes." The long ride to Egypt was a blur of dust and overwhelming anticipation. When my chariot rolled into Goshen, the moment I had dreamt of for 22 years finally materialized. Joseph stood before me, clothed in Egyptian royalty, but his eyes were exactly the same. He threw his arms around my neck, and we wept together for what felt like an eternity. "Now I am ready to die," I told him, "since I have seen your face." Soon after, I found myself standing in the grand, intimidating courts of Pharaoh. I was just an old, weary shepherd, yet I stood before the most powerful man on earth. When he asked my age, I told him the raw truth. My years have been 130, few and difficult. My life had been a brutal pilgrimage of loss. Those final 17 years in Goshen were a beautiful, quiet mercy. We settled, acquired land, and watched our family multiply into a massive number. But as my strength faded at the age of 147, the heavy mantle of leadership pressed down on me one last time. I called for Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, adopting them as my own, weaving them directly into the destiny of Israel. In a moment of divine clarity, I crossed my frail hands, placing the greater blessing on the younger boy, just as God had once chosen me. Then I gathered all 12 of my sons around my bed. I looked into the eyes of the men who had deceived me, and I spoke a raw, prophetic truth over each of them that would shape our future. With my final breath approaching, I made them swear a sacred oath. I could not be left in this foreign land. "Bury me with my fathers," I commanded them. I needed to rest in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, the very field Abraham bought from the Hittite. That dark cave held Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and my faithful Leah. When the words were spoken, I drew my tired feet up into the bed, breathed my last, and was gathered to my people at long last. Joseph threw himself over my body, weeping bitterly and kissing my face. For 40 days, the Egyptian physicians embalmed my earthly shell, while the entire nation of Egypt paused, wailing and mourning my passing for 70 long, solemn days. The pressure was finally lifted. My story did not end with that majestic Egyptian funeral procession. Looking back now, you and I have to grapple with the monumental truth of Jacob's life. I was a deceiver, a terrified fugitive, a grieving father, and a lonely old man. Yet God took every single failure and wove it into an unbreakable promise. What lessons have you drawn from this patriarch? How does this ancient story relate to your own walk of faith? If you are standing in a season of crushing loss, do not keep this message to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that transformation is possible. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. God wants to work powerfully in your life too. We have walked together through the darkest valleys of Canaan and stood in the golden light of Egypt, and I want to leave you with one final thought before this video ends. The fear, the isolation, and the desperate struggle to hold on to your identity. I felt all of it, and I know you feel it too. But the same God who protected my family and turned a pit into a palace is watching over your steps right now. Do not let the silence of your current season convince you that you have been abandoned. The master storyteller is still writing your chapters. Keep fighting, keep seeking the truth, and keep trusting the promise. Thank you for stepping into this incredible history with me today, and I will see you right here next time.